In this episode, we're celebrating the 91st anniversary of an almost forgotten Rockhampton adventurer, one who became the first in the world to achieve something quite extraordinary. This episode of Rockhampton's history is brought to you by Time Safari's Rockhampton Walking Tours. Run every week, day tours reveal the bushrangers, bank heists, and the city's role in World War II, while the night tours take you on a journey through the dark side of the city, with tales of ghosts, murders, and monsters. Click the link below to learn more or to book a ticket. In 1981, New Caledonia released a stamp celebrating the first ever flight from the small Pacific nation to another country. The flight occurred in 1931 and was completed by a young farmer from the Rockhampton region called Victor Roffey, a name that's almost completely forgotten today in Central Queensland. Victor Roffey was born near Bundaberg, Queensland, then moved near Mirabvale before his family bought a property near the township of Dingo. In 1930, Rockhampton's Connor Park Aerodrome was opened along with the Rockhampton Aero Club, and during the ongoing festivities, a young Victor paid for a joy flight on a local plane. Here he simply fell in love with flying and grew determined to become a pilot. The local press described Roffey at the time as an unsophisticated bush lad when he began flying lessons on the 10th of January 1931 with a World War I veteran of the Gallipoli landings and one of the nation's first fighter pilots, Rockhampton's own Harold Livingston Fraser, who I will make a video of later. After talking with the veteran, Roffey agreed to buy a de Havilland DH-60 Gipsy Moth, a British two-seater touring and training aircraft, for around £1,000, but only with the condition that Fraser give him 12 hours of flying lessons. In a newspaper interview at the time, Roffey said that he had no immediate plans to put his aircraft to any particular use. He just wanted to own one, admitting, "Some chaps want a car, but I have always wanted a plane. I'll be satisfied when I land this one at my home." Yes, his family had already set out to build a landing strip on their property. Fraser then admitted that the young lad was a natural and would be flying solo within the week. Everything changed when Roffey began reading about the recent Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm crossing of the Pacific in their plane, the Southern Cross. Now he was desperate to follow in their pioneering flight footsteps, and he set his sights on a small Pacific country. In 1931, Roffey purchased passage for himself and his plane, now called the Golden Eagle, on the La Perouse. This sailed him to New Caledonia. He then spent 8 months training for his flight, taking dozens of locals on their first ever trip in a plane. A Nemea company sales manager remembers his trip. "I was a boy of 10 and Roffey took me up together with a woman from the New Hebrides, and we both trembled with fright. We put on flying helmets and goggles since our heads were poking out of the top." The oil company Shell heard rumours about what the pilot intended and decided to cash in. They made contact with Roffey and agreed to supply the fuel and oil he needed if he mentioned the company during his interviews. After several months, Victor was keen to go, but he soon realised he was in a bit of trouble. A Gipsy Moth had a fuel tank that could carry about 300 miles worth of petrol, while he was looking to fly the 1,000-mile gap between the two countries in one go. Local mechanics were then tasked with giving his plane the once-over. They were also asked to increase the size of the petrol tank so they could hold enough fuel for the entire journey. Once these preparations were done, before he left, he took part in a one-time demonstration to show the growing power of the aeroplane with a mock battle which was fought on the island, with Roffey flying about strafing an armoured car by pelting it with bags of flour bombs. After 9 months on the island, he was ready. He was especially keen to get underway as his sister's wedding was fast approaching. His sister Melba Roffey was about to get married to Roy Laver in Rockhampton, a marriage that would produce the world's greatest ever tennis player, Rockhampton's own Rod Laver, who we talk about during our tours. Word reached Australia about the flight, and local experienced aviators began warning they were unsure such a small plane could make the journey across the Pacific. Fraser, his teacher though, said, "I think he will do it. I don't think there is much risk. I have every confidence in the engine carrying him here." Fraser then admitted he had people watching all along the coast to see if they could spot the plane so he could fly out and lead his people into Connor Park Airfield. Everything was set, but before leaving, Roffey visited a retired sea captain called Charles Legrasse, who gave the young men several local landmarks on the route to help him find his way home. He was also handed a bag of 137 letters that would make him the first pilot to carry airmail from the island. As a final gift, Roffey was handed a pumped-up tyre inner tube to wear around his waist. This makeshift flotation device was his one and only safety item if things went bad and he ended up in the Pacific. After cabling his family he was leaving, at 5 a.m. on the 21st of November 1931, Roffey's engine was thrown into life and the biplane made its way down the runway and into the blue sky. He then pointed the nose at a spot near Gladstone. 1,000 miles of ocean now lay between him and his destination, home. After a few hours of flying, a light shower came in and peppered his plane, but the sky soon cleared and he continued on, straight into the teeth of a Queensland tropical thunderstorm. Soon the winds were getting stronger and the sky grew darker. A heavy thunderstorm rolled across the horizon and Roffey fired up his engine to try and reach 10,000 feet and fly over the storm. But when this failed, he dropped to 7,000 feet where the sky was a lot clearer. Never did the Gipsy Moth's engine falter. 11 hours after having taken off, Roffey saw a long white line on the horizon and realised it was the surf pounding the Queensland coastline. Thinking himself south of the city, the pilot then turned his plane north, but Rockhampton never appeared. After 20 minutes he noticed a railway and some houses along with some open land, so he decided to land and ask for directions. The surprised locals explained he was in Marlborough, just north of Rockhampton. After a refreshing cup of tea and some cakes, Roffey was soon in the air again and flew south, finally landing in Rockhampton at 4:45 p.m. After 11 hours of flight, an all-safe message reached New Caledonia and the island broke out into celebrations. The French and Australian flags were hoisted above Semaphore Hill, alerting everyone nearby of the Australians' triumph. The nation then put a committee together to try and raise funds to celebrate this achievement properly. That night there was a big celebration in Rockhampton, with Shell representatives mixing with local politicians, who read out a cable of congratulations to Roffey from Sir John Goodwin, the Governor of Queensland. 2 days later, Roffey was in the air again, this time flying a special passenger, his father, home to Dingo, where he made his very first mistake. While landing on the town's main street, the wing of his plane clipped a parked car, then drove the machine into some poles. Despite the crash, the locals all ran forward, with members from the local cricket club hoisting Roffey onto their shoulders and carrying their most famous player down the street to his official reception. Further celebrations soon followed in local towns associated with Roffey and his family, but these celebrations soon ended when the Commonwealth Health Officer Edgar North appeared. He charged the adventure with a breach of the Quarantine Act because he failed to get a clear bill of health for himself and his plane. It would seem before taking off from New Caledonia, Roffey received gifts of French champagne and a bouquet of local flowers. But what he did not receive was permission to enter his own nation by the local government, and more specifically, its quarantine border force. They were determined to make an example of this pilot, as he'd just proven that soon other similar flights between Asia and Pacific countries might begin arriving, and their pilots had to be made aware of these dangers. They explained if Roffey wanted to keep the champagne, he was required to pay a duty at a rate of 57 shillings per gallon. Quarantine officials also demanded samples from the bouquet of flowers so they could be examined and declared free of disease. Worse, Roffey had breached quarantine regulations by entering Australia without a pratique. This was the official permission to enter a country, which they said they were unable to overlook due to it being an essential procedure. On the 16th of December 1931, Roffey appeared in the Rockhampton Summons Court, where he pleaded guilty to a breach of quarantine regulations by failing to report to the department at the conclusion of his flight. He was asked to pay a fine of £1. After this, the celebration soon continued though. In 1932, the Connor Park Aerodrome held a celebration of the feat, and Roffey was presented with the Shell Oil Company's Aviation plaque. This was awarded to any aviator who'd undertaken Australia's most notable flights. In attendance was Rocky's mayor and Frank Ford, Rockhampton's future Australian Prime Minister. Roffey later had his plane transported back to Rockhampton where it was repaired. He then continued to fly for another year or so, before crashing his plane and then selling it to a pilot in Mackay called Jack Connor, who was apparently still flying it decades later. And after all this, Roffey settled down to a quiet life in rural Queensland. In November 1971, the people of the island invited back to Noumea the man who was the first to not only land a plane in New Caledonia, but to fly a plane from the nation to another country. Then in 1981, a commemorative postage stamp was issued by the New Caledonian Post Office to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the flight. Unlike so many of these stories where these famous pilots then went missing, Victor Roffey died on September the 22nd, 1993, at the age of 85, and he was buried in his last home, Springshaw, Queensland. Since the 1930s, with a brief revival in the 1970s, the accomplishment of Roffey has all but been forgotten, so I'm pleased I've been able to spark a revival about this pilot, the first to fly from New Caledonia to Australia. This episode of Rockhampton's History is brought to you by my latest novel, Golgotha, a murder mystery crime story set in the trenches of the First World War. When rumours an Allied soldier had been found crucified to a church door in no man's land, an international team of investigators is tasked with finding out the truth behind this crime, and what they uncover will save the war. Golgotha and all my books are available at Amazon and all online stores, and you can find them by clicking the link below. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed that, and I've got more stories coming. Between then, please take one of my tours. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.